Thank you for joining. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa program, and I am Phantom Balete hosting the program. Today, I'm joined by Jonathan Okubai, businessman, Pan-Africanist, and community activist from Toronto, Canada. Jonathan, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Please, Jonathan, would you tell our audience your background and area of expertise, please?
Absolutely. I'm in the real estate business by profession and trade. I am a community leader, a Pan-Africanist as well, involved and interested in matters of the world, while also running my businesses here in Toronto, Canada, as a native.
How do you evaluate the peace agreement undergone in Pretoria in South Africa and in Kenya for the second round between TPLF and federal government of Ethiopia under the auspices of African Union?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at any of these negotiation processes, ultimately, to me, the most important thing is the final result and whether or not the objectives have been reached. At this point in time, looking at the situation in the region regarding this matter, it looks like peace has been obtained. There's been a ceasefire in military activities. There's been disarmament between the parties that have been involved. And it looks like new ground has actually been forged for development to now continue in the area. At the end of the day, peace talks, negotiations, all of that is completely irrelevant unless it's able to actually achieve the goals that it sets out to do so. So the results is really where it matters. And ultimately, time was actually the biggest thing that will tell how successful they've actually been. While there was agreement and there was a general feeling of success once the announcements and negotiations had been made on behalf of the Ethiopian federal government regarding the situation. It was only until the situation actually changed, matters with respect to boots on the ground, that really determined whether or not the negotiations and what was determined was a success. And I think we'll continue to see how effective that has been as it continues into the near future.
What is your view on the peace process? Do you think that this peace agreement is getting implemented on the ground?
I think there are signs that it is. Granted, I'm not there, boots on the ground. I'm not a resident of that area in particular. I can only really determine these things through secondhand sources and what I'm seeing with respect to the matter. But it looks like the situation has changed. It looks like there really has been a disarmament in respect to the military conflict. And I think that's the biggest thing, because ultimately it's the lives of civilians and innocent people who get damaged in the crossfire of all of this. And so whether or not the situation or how much the situation with respect to boots on the ground has changed, I cannot speak definitely towards, but it has been clear and they have shown signs that the military conflict has ended. There has been a ceasefire, there has been disarmament, and there is general peace in the region to allow for a new era of change.
In the visits of the delegation led by Speaker of House of People's Representative and representatives of African Union and ambassadors of different countries to Mekelle, do you think that their mission was successful?
The general peace process as a whole and the negotiations that took place were aiming to obtain peace in the region and result in military disarmament with respect to the war that was going on. The actions that have been taken thus far and the peace that we've seen sort of settle in the area, I think allude to the fact that yes, it has been a success. And the African Union involvement and the involvement of neighboring countries or other leaders has been a positive impact on this whole negotiation process as a whole, with respect to coming in to help and create solutions and find solutions for people on the ground. But ultimately, time will be the greatest teller. Early stages right now, we've seen changes with respect to the situation in the area. Now, whether that continues into the future will be a whole different story.
Ethiopian government is now focusing on rehabilitating the war-torn region, and it costs us huge material and financial resources. What do you suggest other stakeholders in this regard?
Absolutely. I think it's in everyone's interest in the region to see this region rehabilitated. If we look back through history, we can see a couple different examples of how things play out. When I think about Germany in World War I, for example. Now, Germany is an independent nation, but when you look at the situation in the area and Ethiopia's ethno-federalistic makeup, you do see this sort of racial, ethnicity, and political affiliation and connection when it comes to how people view the situation. And I'll make it a little bit easier to understand. So after World War I, Germany and the Allied forces really destroyed Germany, and afterwards they had taken the approach that they needed to contain Germany, that they needed to make sure that Germany was never able to rise up again, so that it could never be a threat to the forces in the outside world. Now, what had actually happened was the Germans felt this and their pride was damaged, and there was a lot of resentment towards the Axis forces in the outside world with respect to the way that they had treated them after the World War had ended, and the way that they had tried to contain them and suppress their growth into the future. And so this situation and this resentment that was built up within the society allowed for a guy called Adolf Hitler to come out of there and use the resentment of that society to say, look, I'm your new savior. I'm the answer to your problems. All of these guys, whether it's, of course, the resentment that was built towards the Jews or the other forces in the West, they are the enemy. And it's clear that they do not want us to see us succeed. And I'm going to be the answer to make sure that this doesn't happen. And we all know what came about as a result of that, which is World War II and everything else that's situated as a result of it. Now, compare this to Japan after World War II, a big enemy of the West and the United States, a huge threat in terms of their political interests. And Japan was such a threat that the United States came in and dropped two nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to not only completely destroy the area and the region, but also led to demoralizing the people and effectively ending the war. Now, after that had happened, I think the United States had gone a little bit smarter and decided we're not going to try to contain Japan, but instead we're going to turn around and we're going to be an ally in helping to build them up and support them in their new growth. And what they ended up actually doing was converting Japan into an ally of the United States and the region. And even to this day, we see almost 100 years later that Japan is a key ally of the West with respect to the United States and Japan's interest as well. So I think the scenarios and the situations are different, but I think the underlying lessons are very similar. And leaders in the Horn, leaders in the region, leaders in Africa can sort of look at what they want to do with the situation in Tigray. They can say, this has been, we've had hostilities, and this is respect to the Ethiopian federal government as well. We've had hostilities with this region. There's a disarmament, but now it must be contained. Or they can take the approach that was taken with Japan and say, look, we are not your enemy. We are all one. We are all one people. We serve under one identity. And this is not some sort of ethnic antagonism that we have, but rather it was a political and military disagreement that had taken place. Now that this is over, we are interested in completely rehabilitating this region and seeing it come back. And I think the people of that region will probably really appreciate it. I think over time, it will sort of manage the maybe even generational resentments that have come about that have led to where the situation led to today, and actually lead to a more peaceful transition into the future where everyone can prosper and economic development can actually take place.
Since the federal government and the TPLF have agreed to bring lasting peace in the country, what do you suggest Africans and fellow Ethiopians in the diaspora and in the country to speed up the process?
That's a really good question. I think it is about how discussions are had, and the perspectives that we take as individuals and continue to push within the public discussion. I think the biggest thing for Ethiopia is really pushing for and trying to assimilate within a national Ethiopian identity. If you look at the design of the Ethiopian political system, again, it is an ethno-federalistic system, which has created its own issues where there are political affiliations tied to ethnicities. And so when there is political disagreement, the lines get blurred, unfortunately, about whether this is some sort of ethnic prejudice or it's a disagreement on political ideas. So that is going to make it very difficult for Ethiopia moving forward, and the diaspora to have these conversations. But despite the fact that there is a very, very, very diverse country. It's a very diverse country with respect to not only ethnicities, but language and religion. I think it's important that not only Ethiopians themselves, not only the diaspora themselves, not only leaders of other areas in the region themselves, but everyone as a collective begin to buy into the Ethiopian national identity as much as they can, because the only way to really succeed moving forward is to focus on the commonalities that bring the people together, rather than attempting to focus on the differences within the ethnicities or the religion or the cultures or the language themselves. And with that, I think you've sort of create a platform for productive conversation to be had. If we're constantly focusing on our differences, it makes it very, very difficult to actually have productive discussions and development moving forward.
This peace process is mainly held under the guidance of African Union, and many political commentators are taking it as a milestone where Africans showed the global community that they can solve their own problem under their own mechanisms. Do you agree?
I agree 100%. I think Africans have been deceived throughout history because of the involvement of external powers and external forces who have their own interests in what we say, think, or do. I think it's in the best interest of Africans as a whole to be the ones to find our own solutions, because only we truly understand our own problems, and only we truly have all of the equity in seeing that this situation or the matters are at hand are a success. Because if my neighbor's house is burning, my house is next. And if I know that, and if all the neighbors know and understand that, the way we have these discussions and the ideas that we're going to contribute are going to be more likely than not in the best interest of the region and of our neighborhood, versus someone coming from outside and deciding to purport their own ideas with their own agenda and own interests at hand. So I think it's been a great milestone for the African Union. I'd like to continue to see Africans and African nations coming together to help solve each other's problem. If I'm having an issue, at home, why not? If we use a family example, why not my uncle come in or my cousins come in and assist us in finding some solution, because ultimately it will lead to the peace and prosperity of the family as a whole, right? So I'm very glad to see the African Union as a key stakeholder and implementer of the solutions at hand.
The federal government of Ethiopia has taken strong commitment in bringing this conflict into peaceful end. What should other stakeholders do to speed up this process?
I think the first thing they would do is ask the federal government of Ethiopia how they can support them. I think that's the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit. Ultimately, it is the federal government of Ethiopia's responsibility to push the national dialogue, to push for the solutions that need to be made on the ground, whether it's food, aid, peace, security. It is the responsibility of the Ethiopian federal government to lead the charge on these things, but other neighbors, other stakeholders have an opportunity to come in and ask the federal government, how can we support you? Because they are going to need a lot of support. They're not going to really be able to do this all by themselves. And there is a need for multiple stakeholders to be able to come in and assist the federal government in seeing its objectives through. So I would start there. I think that's a very, very simple and easy place to start. And from there, I'm sure there's many conversations that can be had to see other matters through.
Ethiopia is on the process of organizing national dialogue in the country in the near future. What is this national dialogue and why is it important?
I think the national dialogue is extremely important. It needs to be had. The only way you can find solutions is through discussion. I mean, that's the start of any solution, is finding common ground and seeing where solutions can be found that meet everybody's interests at the end of the day. And it also folds within the greater interest of the peace, prosperity, and development of the nation as a whole. Ethiopia's got a big job in sort of managing to bring, I think, each identity and each perspective within the fold of a greater Ethiopian perspective and a greater Ethiopian identity. The other thing of note is, I think, and this speaks to Ethiopia, but Africa as a whole hasn't really found a common enemy. And Ethiopians need to come to terms on what that common enemy is, whether it's development, peace, whether it's forging a national identity, or maybe it's all of the three above. But Ethiopians as a whole have to be able to see that, they are not each other's enemy. They've got to also work as a whole to and of course this is very, very, I'm talking, this is an idealistic world, and we're talking an idealistic situation. Matters on the ground are always a lot more complicated than what we're discussing today. But forging a national identity, finding a common enemy, whether that's prosperity or economic development, as a whole, I think will set the tone for where discussions can lead to. Discussions are extremely important, I think, because the level of hostility that we've seen through, inter-ethnic tribalism has gotten to a place where it's just absolutely crazy. If we're talking about civil war and, the level of violence and destruction that we've seen over the couple of years. So there's a lot of healing that needs to be done within the society, and resentments that need to be cast aside if the nation is going to move forward as a whole. And I think discussion and a national dialogue and a discourse and understanding of what are our problems, and then where can we find common ground to move towards solution, need to be had if Ethiopia is going to continue to exist as a sovereign, strong nation state moving forward into the future.
From your experience, when is a country forced to organize a national dialogue, and which countries have succeeded and which have failed?
Unfortunately, oftentimes when you look at when national dialogue or the push for national dialogue conversations to be had often happen too late and well after violence or military actions have ensued. It's just the nature of, I guess, human nature. No one takes it seriously until it really reaches a breaking point or a sort of tipping point where things get out of hand. I think we can look to a country in the region, actually, not too far away, called Rwanda as a success story with respect to national dialogue. I'm sure most people are well aware of the genocide that ensued in 1994 as a result of the ethnic tensions between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Shortly thereafter, the new established government that came into power began to set about reforms and discussions to be had on a national level regarding the genocide, and allowed each individual community to come to solutions on what the perpetrators or the victims' future would look like. I think they've done a fairly good job of managing that as a whole. It's very, very difficult to completely eliminate these types of ideas and thinking within a society as a whole. It's natural. Humans are tribal. But if we look at what they've been able to do over the last 20 to 30 years, we can say that their process of national dialogue has been a success. With respect to countries where that national dialogue has not been a success, it becomes a lot more difficult, I think, to begin to point them out. I think success or prosperity in and of itself is more of an anomaly. The lack thereof or a failure for progress and discussions to be had can be seen, to be honest with you, in a lot of places across the world. I think that is a lot more common than actually seeing successful national dialogues where things move towards a more productive future, because that's a lot more challenging. It's really, really difficult to get a society to move past the ethnic tensions that may have been steeped and set in place for generations, potentially, problems that have accumulated for much longer than the people alive participating in it are even a part of. So the successes, I think, are a lot more rare than the failures. I think the failures can be seen in a lot of places. Very recently in Sudan, we saw a split between North and South Sudan. I think maybe you can use that as an example of a failure for national dialogue. Although, of course, like in all of these situations, I have to preface by saying that it's not just about national dialogue, and there's so many interests and so many problems at heart that lead to these scenarios. But at the end of the day, there was one Sudan and now there are two. So I hope that answers your question. But there are a lot more examples outside of Sudan where these successes have not been able to be accomplished for many reasons, more than one.
When a national dialogue is held, who should participate and what should their role be before, during, and after the dialogue?
Yeah, I think everyone needs to participate, because ultimately everyone is a stakeholder. People with lived experience, when we're talking about everyone, we can talk about that within the political sphere, meaning opposition parties and the different factions that are at play in the area, as well as the federal government and their interests. But then, as well as boots on the ground, people with lived experience, leaders who are a part of the peace and rebuilding process. Ultimately, everyone needs to be a part of the conversation moving forward. And whether or not everyone's voice is a part of, the ultimate solution, is a different question. I think ultimately any leader has to look at a situation and canvas all of the perspectives that are out there, allow people's voices to be heard, and then pick and choose what makes sense for the situation on the ground and make a decision based on their best knowledge, right? So I'm not sure there's much to be gained from stifling voices, from saying that one group shouldn't be heard, or this opposition party shouldn't be heard. Of course, you understand that everyone has their own interests in why they're proclaiming the solution that they're putting forth, but their opinion should at least be heard at the very least, and taken into consideration when moving forward.
Who is mostly beneficiary from the dialogue?
I would hope that the people are most benefiting from the national dialogue, because ultimately it is their homes, their businesses, their schools, their hospitals that were on the front lines of most of the damage and destruction that took place over the course of the war. Ultimately, they all have to benefit from the same discussion.
What do you suggest Africans in the diaspora, activists and stakeholders do to support this national dialogue to be fruitful?
Well, the first thing I would say is for people to know what they're talking about before they decide to open their mouth and spew off opinions and thoughts. I think we live in an era in general where people think it's more important to have an opinion than to actually know what they're talking about. And unfortunately, a lot of people are running around with opinions in which they've had no real thought or real intention behind, and spew off these opinions from the mountaintop and cause more destruction and resentment as a whole than is productive for a national peace and rebuilding process. So the first thing I would say is for people to really stay quiet if they really don't know and are uninformed about the situation. I think that in and of itself is a net positive. And then the next step, like any peace or rebuilding process, is to extend a hand across the aisle and open up the conversation and see where common ground can be made, and see where resources can be shared. But that applies to any peace or rebuilding process. It's not particular to Ethiopia and as a whole, but the approach to finding solutions as a human being.
Have you got any final message for all Africans and people watching us before we wind up?
When you're in survival mode, there's a general approach and relation that people take when they're in survival mode. They're willing to take a lot more risks and make decisions that are at the detriment of themselves and their neighbors. Once you're able to escape survival mode, you can start to make better decisions and start to evaluate the morality in the decisions that you're making. I think a lot of the problems in Africa are a result of people existing in survival mode and really having nothing really to lose or risk. Now, for us to get out of that situation, it goes back to the first point I made, which is Africans as a whole identifying a common enemy. We are not each other's enemy, really and truly. And oftentimes there are external forces who are very, very happy to see us destroy each other at the behest of their own interests. It is a game of divide and conquer if you look at the global game of geopolitics as a whole. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of how we are being manipulated for the interests of others. We need to be aware of the fact that we are not each other's enemy. And we also need to be aware of what that common enemy is. I think economic development might be a good place to start. Prosperity might be a good place to start. And if we can start to approach everything that we do through that lens, it will lead us to make a lot better decisions as a whole, not only within these small regions, but across the continent.
Jonathan Okubai, businessman, Pan-Africanist, and community activist. Thank you for your time and for your analysis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here.
Dear viewers of OBN Horn of Africa, this brings us to the end. Till we meet with another analysis, stay blessed.